I mentioned in the first lesson that one of the criticisms of the book of Esther is that the name of God is never mentioned in it. In fact, some people thought it should not even be in the Bible. Actually, there was a big fight when the Jews put together the Old Testament, whether Esther would be included. There was a big fight when they put together the New Testament, would Esther be in there? But there's something interesting I want to show you because it applies to our lesson today. This word up here, Yahweh, is the Hebrew name for God. Now, in Hebrew, they do not put vowels in their words. You just have heard someone say it, and so you know what goes there. Problem is, how many people do you know that you've heard speak Hebrew? And when you deal with an ancient language, how do you know what it used to be? So this is how they would write the name of God. That is translated God sometimes. It is translated the Lord sometimes. Yahweh. But on your paper is a piece of a little bit of script of the Hebrew Bible. I'm not sure where this passage is from, and I hope I have it right side up. But I wanted you to see it, and don't we praise God that somebody translated that for us so we can know what it says. But you notice all of those letters are the same size. There are some copies, some ancient manuscripts of Esther, where those scribes who copied it did something very unusual. Now, I have used the English letters, but they put these 4 letters in real tall letters in the script. And they put the rest of it just between them, because they are mentioning God, even though the text does not. Now, that doesn't mean God's name is in Esther. That means the guys that were copying it figured out something rather clever to get God's name in there. But I think where this occurs, it occurs 5 times in the book of Esther, and 4 of them are in today's lesson. So I wanted you to know about that. Now, some people read this and they pronounce it Jehovah, which came like 200 to 400 years after Jesus. There is no J sound in the Hebrew language. And they say this was a V instead of a W sound. But you know, to be honest, when that word originated, we don't know what it sounded like. I think Jehovah is probably not the best translation. There are some, quote, religions today that say you have to call God by that name. So I prefer Yahweh, even though my English tongue doesn't want to say that. All right, let's look at today's lesson. Let me just tell you that the first time this secret message about God appears, it is in chapter 1, verse 20. Do you remember that lesson? Vashti had disobeyed her husband, the king, and the people who were with him at the banquet said, "You need another queen, and let's make a law of the Medes and the Persians that every wife should give her husband honor," is the King James translation. That word means dignity, value. Actually, I think I said it meant obey. It does not. It means to honor the position of your husband. That's not a loophole. I'm just telling you what the word means. Well, in chapter 5, there has been hatched this horrible plot to kill all of the Jews. And Mordecai, who had adopted Esther as a child, sent her a message that since she's the queen now, she needs to talk to the king about this law. So this is where we pick up today. She was afraid to do it because of that law that said you could not approach the king without his permission. If you came into his court and he did not want to see you, what was the penalty? Death, right then. So this is, I understand her reservation in this. And today we have, after 3 days of fasting, chapter 5, verse 1 says, on the third day, Esther put on her royal apparel. But actually, apparel is not in the Hebrew. She put on royalty. You know, I think every bride does that. She didn't come to him in her fasting sackcloth and ashes. I have known some Christian women who felt like it was a virtue to pay no attention to their appearance, which I'm not sure the verse for that. But I will say when it was important, Esther put on royalty. She looked like a queen. And it says when she came into the inner court of the king's house, he's sitting on his throne. And verse 2, when he sees her standing there, that she obtained favor in his sight. And he showed this to his staff around him by holding out his scepter for her to touch. Now, this is a very precious thing. The words that are translated showed favor means someone in authority who uses that authority to bring someone lower toward him. The Greek equivalent is used in a couple of places in Ephesians and in Romans. I've given you those references, but I want you to listen what it says. Paul wrote, through Christ, we have access to the Father. Another one, by Jesus Christ, we have access by faith into the grace of God. Do you realize that none of us could ever have passed from this condition of rejection of God and insistence on our own way had the Father not reached out to us through the person of his Son? And it is only Jesus that bridges this gap. Now, I know I put this up a lot, but I want to tell you, I talk to a lot of mature people in church that don't seem to understand that. They think this gap is bridged by good works that we do or by spiritual knowledge. Now, I was one of those people. I thought because I did good things, I was faithful to church, and you did not want to play Bible trivia with me, that made me a Christian. Christian habits do not make you a Christian, although you will have Christian habits when you are. So that is a very wonderful word. And also, what would be the penalty for anybody that wanted to access God not by that way? It would be death. You see the picture here? It's really neat. Well, ancient historians portray this king, which we've called Xerxes. The King James calls him by another name, which is a title for a ruler. He was a very rash and impetuous and unpredictable man. One time in his reign, an old gentleman brought his adult son with him, and he was asking Xerxes that his son be excused from military duty so he could take care of him. And Xerxes had the son killed right in front of the man because he didn't like that. That's the kind of guy he was. I understand that Esther was a little bit leery to approach this man. But even though he's not called for her for 30 days, he's glad to see her. This is a guy that is also seemingly swayed by feminine beauty, who had a pool of virgins to choose from every night. And then after he had sex with them, they went into his pool of concubines, maybe never to see him again. He was a sensuous man. So I like that God kind of used his flaws to fulfill his will. He sees Esther. She's beautiful. She put on royalty, and he extends favor to her. And then the king said to her in verse 3, what we would translate that to be is, what is it? Or what's up? Or why'd you come? He pretty well knew she didn't risk her life to come unless something was on her mind. But I think from the beginning, he thinks, I'm going to do whatever she wants. Because in verse 3, he says, I'll give you up to half of the kingdom, whatever you want. I think he's telling her he's going to be generous, not that he's going to have an accountant figure out the value of half of his kingdom, but he will be generous. Well, Esther's been fasting for 3 days. I wish we were told she had been praying, but that is not mentioned in Esther. Another reason people don't like the book. So she comes before him, and when she gets her chance, look at verse 4. Look how careful she is. She says, if it seems good unto the king, let the king and Haman, this is the one who had the plan to kill all the Jews in the kingdom, come this day unto the banquet I have prepared for him. So she asked them to come to lunch. Now, one of those mystery appearances of the word of God's name is in the word, over the word banquet in that verse. So that's what God was going to use to fulfill his will. And so that was a good plan to invite men to a meal. You would think that would be a reception. And so verse 6, when the king and Haman get there, he says, all right, what do you want me to do? I'll give you half of my kingdom. That's the second time he's offered that. And then answered Esther, my petition and verse 7, my petition and my request is, if I've found favor in your sight, and if it pleases you to grant my request and perform it, let the king and Haman come to the banquet I shall prepare for them tomorrow. Now, I've always wondered, why'd she do 2 banquets? And we're not told. I think one reason might be she got to this point and she couldn't bring herself to say what she wanted to say. Because you got to remember that not only the king is there, who is her husband, but also Haman is there. When you think of Haman, think of him this way. He was evil. He was an evil man. She may have been taken back by his presence there. Or God may have told her to do it this way. We don't know. However, God is going to use it because the situation is not where God wants it to be today. But boy, it's going to be there tomorrow. That's what we see in this. Well, verse 9 says, that day went Haman forth joyful and with a glad heart. But when he saw his enemy, Mordecai, in the king's gate, and he did not stand up or move for Haman, he was suddenly full of wrath. Now, we saw Mordecai behave this way in chapter 3, when the king made a law that everyone had to pay reverence to Haman. But we talked about the meaning of that word in that lesson. It does not mean worship. It can mean worship, but that's the 13th definition. Or the 11th, I can't remember. It was way down in the list of what that word means. This just means to stand up in the presence. Now, that's just like manners, and we still do that in America. If you've ever been in court, what does that bailiff say? All rise. And it's not because you need exercise, it's to show respect for the judge that comes. I remember as a child at church when a woman walked up on the platform maybe to sing a song, the men sitting on the platform would stand up. Now, after the 60s, when we took away courtesy, that has changed. I don't know if that happens anywhere today. I don't know if you can get any of your church elders to sit on the platform because they don't do it here. But that it sent nonverbal message to Haman from Mordecai. I don't respect you. Everybody else may stand up for you, but I'm not standing up. I don't think that's a very godly attitude. You don't have to like people to be respectful. I wish we could have a little respect flowing both ways in Washington instead of fighting and talking ugly. Well, verse 10 says, "Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, who was his wife. And he told them," look at verse 11, "Would you like to have been invited to this party?" He told them, "The glory of his own riches, the multitude of his children," I think Zeresh had something to do with those, "all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how the king had advanced him above everyone else in the kingdom." Warren Wiersbe said, "Pride is the only disease that makes everybody sick except the person that has it." What a party to hear how wonderful Haman was. Kind of reminded me of John Barrymore. I don't know if you know him. He's an old actor. He's the father of the Barrymore family. Many are actors. This is what he said once: "One of my chief regrets during my years in the theater is that I couldn't sit in the audience and watch me." He's just this. He's just this evil guy. Well, Haman is still bragging, and in verse 12 he says, "Moreover, Esther the queen didn't let any other man come in with the king to the banquet she prepared but myself. And tomorrow I'm invited unto her also." This sounds like he's thinking he's going to be king. Well, yet, look at verse 13. "Yet all this avails me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate," which was a governmental position. Now, this is the first time the word Jew is used in Scripture, because after the captivity, people called them Jews from the tribe of Judah. But this is the first time that it's used. And guess what? Another one of those hidden messages is over Mordecai the Jew. Well, verse 14, his lovely wife Zeresh, and that name means star of adoration, which is part of the meaning of Esther's Persian name. It was for one of the female deities of Persia. This woman reminds me very much of Jezebel. She says, "Well, let a gallows be made 7.5 stories high, and tomorrow in the morning, tell the king you want Mordecai hanged on it, and then you can come in happily to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Now, translated gallows, it was not that. It was a pole on which they impaled people until they died. It was a very terrible death. It did not have to be 7.5 stories high to work. All right, chapter 6. And we begin to see part of the reason for the delays. On that night, between the banquets, the king could not sleep. You ever have nights when you can't sleep? The Hebrew says the king's sleep fled away. Fled away. But what is at stake is not only the race of Jewish people, but who is going to come from the race of Jewish people? Christ, who is going to provide the access to God. There's an awful lot at stake here. So what does he do? Does he get up and get some warm milk and a turkey sandwich? Did he take sleeping medicine? Persians had potions for sleep. Did he send for his musicians? Or send for a concubine? He did none of those things. He said, somebody bring the records of my kingdom and read them. Boy, that sounds interesting. But Xerxes, like Haman, liked to hear about himself. So they brought them. And in Persia, their best poets wrote the chronicles of their kingdom. So they would be interesting to hear. But they would not be on a book where you could go to this chapter. They were on a scroll. And there were many scrolls. And so when you pulled one out, you probably pulled it out open to the part, these strange letters, that the last person looked at. So they go to get this scroll, and they just happen to choose the one that has the account of Mordecai hearing about the plot to kill the king and reporting it to Esther, who reported it to Xerxes, who investigated and found it true. And the people who plotted were killed. But the king knew about that. This has probably been several years, maybe 3. And he says to the person reading, how do we ever honor Mordecai for saving my life? Now, this was an important thing in the Persian kingdom because that was how he maintained loyalty. If you did something good, you got a fine reward. And the reader says, nothing. You didn't do anything for him. Well, he decides he has to fix this right now. This man who didn't mind doing injustice on a moment's notice is now wide awake and wants to perform justice in the middle of the night. This is remarkable, isn't it? Verse 4, just at that moment, there's commotion in the hallway. And who was out there? Haman. Now, why has he come to the king? To ask him to kill Mordecai. Oh, the timing of this. How interesting. Why do you think it's working out this way? Is there somebody moving events? Yes. He orders events to accomplish his will, and he even orders the words and the actions of people who do not know him or regard him. We serve a wonderful God. So Haman comes in, and before he can speak, the king says, Haman, what should be done to somebody the king really wants to honor? And of course, Haman thinks, who would he want to honor but moi? So he comes up with something that always sounded silly to me, but it was something that had never been done in Persia. He said, all right, clothe that man with your robe, the kingly robe. Persians believed the king's robe had like superpowers. And let him ride on your horse with the crown on his head. Now the Hebrew means the horse's crown, not the kingdom crown. You know how men have always liked big hood ornaments on their cars? Well, horses in ancient times wore ornaments, and it showed who was riding it by the ornament that was on it. I think in the 10 Commandments, when Pharaoh comes out of Egypt and all his charioteers, all those horses have something on their head. And Pharaoh's horse had the best one on his head. It was like driving his car, the bulletproof limousine. Let him ride in that, and let someone go before him in the streets and shout, this is what happens to the man the king wants to honor. And Haman is waiting for the king to say, all right, let's do that for you. But instead, look at verse 10. He tells Haman, get on this and do that for, Mordecai, the one he was coming in to ask the king to kill, the one he considers his enemy. And does he do it? He didn't have. I remember saying to my son sometimes, well, you don't have to like it. You just have to do it. Which was kind of what happened right here. We're not told anything that Mordecai said or anything that he thought during this. He may have thought, I hope this is a sign for good. But you remember that the edict the king made on the 12th month, on the 13th day, all the Jews in Persia were supposed to be killed. And whoever did the job could take their wealth. That's still in effect. I think Haman was thinking, if I can just make it till the 12th month, I'll be rid of this. It says that he took Mordecai, verse 11, and proclaimed that before him. This is how the king honors a man he wants to honor. I don't think he proclaimed it very loud because he didn't like that. Or he may have stomped while he proclaimed it because he hated what he was doing. Look at verse 12. When this silly thing is done, Mordecai comes again to the king's gate. That means he went back to work. He wasn't looking for a promotion. He didn't feel any entitlement. And Haman ran back to his home with his head covered, which is a way of showing shame. Verse 13, Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, I guess they were still there from the night before, what had happened. And then his wise men and his wife said to him, oh, if Mordecai is of the Jewish race before whom you have begun to fall, this doesn't sound well for you, my friend. We would say, Haman, your number is up. You're dead meat. Now, I don't know if Zeresh and his friends knew that God had said to Abraham, the father of the Jews, whoever curses you, I will curse. But boy, that was like the law of the Medes and Persians. That law is not altered. God's law is not altered. Well, verse 14 says, while they were yet talking, the king's chamberlains came to take Haman to the next banquet. He didn't have time to make a plan B. This has to be one of the best stories in the world. Well, chapter 7. It is an account, not a false story, not a fiction, but a true account. So, the king and Haman come to the banquet with Esther, the queen, and for what seems like the millionth time, the king says, Esther, what is your request? I will fulfill it up to a half of the kingdom. And now she does answer. I believe her knees might have been shaken. I hope her voice was strong. But look how polite she is. To Xerxes, who was not a man who exactly merited respect by his behavior, she says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases you, let my life be given me at my request, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Those were the exact words that Haman had written in that law of what was to happen on the 13th day of the 12th month to all the Jewish people, that they would be destroyed, they would be killed, and they would perish. And I'm sure Xerxes is thinking, what is she talking about? Because you see, he gave Haman his ring to write the law and to sign it with his ring. He didn't even know who Haman was talking about when he said, there are people in your kingdom you need to get rid of. And then Esther says, but if we'd been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue because I don't want to annoy the king. Actually, the Hebrew there is very difficult, and your translation may say something weird. But I thought the smartest guys, because it borrows a word from Persian that we don't have anything to compare to. I think she said, I don't want to annoy you with this. I don't want to bother you with this. She wisely avoids the detail that, this law was written in the name of you, and it was sealed by your signet ring. Do you remember who you gave your ring to? She didn't say that. Well, verse 5, then the king answered and said unto Esther, who is he and where is he that would dare presume in his heart to do this thing? Who is this that wants to kill my queen and all of her family? Bless his heart, he hadn't connected the dots yet to realize who it is. And one of the 5 hidden names of God is in that verse. Now, I could not find exactly where it is in the verse, but the Hebrew guys said that it was there. And then, and only then, does Esther say the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. Do you have an adversary? The devil. Do you have an enemy? You do. I bet he worked a little bit to keep you from coming this morning. Karen, I'm glad you beat him. Lou, I'm glad you beat him. You didn't feel well either. Then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. Isn't this amazing? His life has gone from the highest honor, second in command, being invited to the banquet with the king and the queen, being the only one invited to the banquet, to the humiliation of having to walk before Mordecai, who was wearing the king's robe and riding in the king's horse on his horse. And now, he is in, deep weeds? Because this crazy king is angry. And just at this moment, one of the 7 chamberlains that stayed in the king's presence, or eunuchs or servants, speaks up. Well, not at this moment. First, Xerxes stomps out to the garden. He might have been going out there to get his military guys. He might have been going out there to decide what was the worst enough penalty for Haman for wanting to kill his queen. Verse 7 says he got up from the banquet in wrath, and Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther to help him because he knew that he was in trouble. Verse 8 says the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet, and Haman was fallen onto the bed where Esther was. This was like Bible times where people at feast ate reclining. And it looked to Xerxes like he was trying to, actually Xerxes used the word for sexually force his wife. He used a very strong Hebrew word. He said, will you rape the queen in front of me? Haman may have been kissing her feet in contrition, but no man was ever supposed to be in the presence of the queen unless the king was there. Haman should have left. If I was him, I would have gone out the other door from where Xerxes went. So it was he's wrong on every count. Verse 9, one of those eunuchs or chamberlains is mentioned, Harbona. In chapter 1, you remember when the king was having that long party and there was a lot of drinking, and the king sent his chamberlains or his eunuchs to get the queen to come wear her crown and show them her beauty. These were the guys that were sent to Vashti to get her. Now, we don't have in the Bible that she ever said anything, but she didn't go with them. Historians say the king sent these men several times, and Vashti would not come. So this is one of the guys that had that experience. But apparently he was there at the banquet. He might have been in the wings at the first banquet. He's been watching Esther, and he sees a difference between the two queens. I'm sorry, I now see that I missed on verse 7. That's one of the names of God over the words, there was evil determined against Haman, and this is surely God moving to judge him. So he speaks up, this eunuch speaks up to the king, and he says, well, you know, Haman built a gallows or execution pole that's 7.5 stories high, and he made it for Mordecai. And he doesn't call Mordecai the Jew. What does this eunuch call Mordecai? The one who spoke good to the king, the one who did good to the king, the one who saved the king's life. Maybe this was the eunuch reading to him from that scroll last night. I don't know how he knew about those gallows. Except if it's 7.5 stories, you would notice that. You would notice that. Well, Xerxes, who took many suggestions from many people, whether they were good or not, makes a decision on his own. And it is to execute Haman on that now. Verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. This is like 24 hours from the first banquet to the second banquet. It's just boom, boom, boom. If we were an audience watching, we would hardly believe it. It's moving so fast and so dramatically. But that pacified the king's wrath. You know, the Psalm says in several places, if you dig a pit for someone else, you fall into it yourself. If you lay a trap for someone, it traps you. That is very true. That must mean that as a man sows, he also reaps. Is that as effective as the laws of the Medes and the Persians that could not be altered? Yes, it is. Does it always happen this fast? No. Sometimes. Not always, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. You know, that's another criticism for the book of Esther. There are no miracles or judgments of God in it. But I think the greatest miracle in Esther is that God manipulated this tremendous change of fortune in 24 hours through people that didn't know him. And he did it all without a miracle. Who would have thought it? If they'd handed you the first 5 chapters and said, write the outcome, who would have thought of that? Nobody would have. Were the Jews saved by good luck? Were they saved because Esther fasted and merited a little good luck? Well, if she prayed, it had something to do with it, but the word for prayer is not in the book of Esther. Any of the 5 words for prayer. You know, sometimes I look at Haman and I see a tool of Satan. And I feel like the Hamans of our world seem to have so much power. And I get really tired of it. And I want to see them get what's coming to them. Is God ever hindered by any plan of Satan? Never. God is never hindered. What about somebody who's under the influence of Satan that you're praying for? And you've been praying for a long time. can God do something in that situation? Is he still on his throne? You remember, some of you will remember that song Brother Thomas taught us years ago. God is still on his throne, and he remembers his own. Though trials beset us and friends forsake us, he still will take care of his own. That is so true. Well, that's the message I get from these chapters. I wonder what else you see. It does. Karen, that's a good thought. God is always against pride. Pride never endears anyone to God, nor does it provide a path to God. Pride always comes before a fault. I know we like to look at Jeopardy sometimes during supper because we like to try to answer the questions. There was a guy on night before last, and he told in his interview time how he had made a perfect score on the ACT, the SAT, and he tutored college students. And I thought, the poor other contestants, they don't have a chance. And what happened? He didn't even get to Final Jeopardy. And I thought when he said that, ooh, that's prideful. And what an example God gave us in a silly show.